Have you ever been judged just because of your appearance? Imagine you're walking home after a long day. Everything seems normal until the glare of police headlights locks onto you. A sharp voice cuts through the air. Do you live around here? You haven't done anything wrong, yet suddenly you're a suspect. Have you ever wondered what would happen if the person standing in front of the police that night was you? This story isn't just about justice. It's about power, prejudice, and a shocking truth no one saw coming. Watch until the end to find out what really happened in the courtroom that day. And leave a comment. Who do you think this could happen to? The nighttime air in Nashville always carried a distinct stillness. A light breeze swept through the empty streets, while the warm glow of streetlights cast scattered reflections across the pavement. In a parked patrol car on the corner of West End Avenue, Lieutenant Ava Taylor sat still, her eyes tracking every movement. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just keeping an eye on things. At least that's what she told herself. But then she saw him, a tall black man dressed in a dark suit. His stride was slow, deliberate, unrushed, confident, unapologetic, unafraid. Ava didn't like that. Too calm, too composed. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She flicked on the headlights and the patrol car rolled forward, slowly approaching him. The window slid down, the silence between them so thick that even their breathing felt loud. Do you live around here? Her voice was sharp, laced with something unspoken. The man turned his head, locking eyes with her. No hesitation, no fear. Excuse me? His voice was deep, unnervingly steady. Ava didn't like that either. She wanted to see fear, wanted to see uncertainty. She opened the car door and stepped out. You match the description of a suspect. A simple sentence, but one that shifted everything. The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharpening. What description? Ava crossed her arms, grounding herself in authority. Dark suit, tall, seen near the area of a recent break-in. In that moment, the streetlight cast a clear glow on the man's face. His expression wasn't one of fear, not of confusion, but of disappointment. He exhaled slowly, like someone who had lived through this exact moment far too many times before. I see. His voice remained calm, but something deeper flickered behind his eyes. Ava felt her blood heat up. She didn't want to lose control of the situation. Show me your ID. The man shook his head, deliberately slow, not because he didn't have one, but because he already knew exactly where this was going. And he was right. Ava stood facing the man, her gaze sharp under the yellow glow of the street lamp. Only a few steps separated them, but the tension between them was stretched tight, like a wire ready to snap. Show me your ID. The man let out a sigh, not of defiance, not of anger, just a sigh, as if he had known this moment was inevitable. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket. Careful. Ava stepped forward, her voice razor sharp. Keep your hands where I can see them. He stopped, then raised both hands slowly, his eyes locked onto hers in silence. May I ask why you're stopping me? Ava clenched her jaw. She didn't need a reason, but she gave one anyway. You match the description of a suspect. The man raised an eyebrow, as if he had heard this line too many times before. Is that so? His voice was unsettlingly calm. And what exactly is that description? Ava folded her arms, grounding herself in authority. Dark suit, tall, seen near the scene of a break-in. In that moment, she noticed the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. Not out of fear, but disappointment. A deep, quiet disappointment, as if he had heard these words before, too many times. I see. That simple response irritated Ava. She was used to suspects stumbling over their words, scrambling for an excuse, pleading their innocence. But he just stood there, steady, unwavering. She wanted control of this situation. I need to search you. The man inhaled slowly, as if wrestling with something inside himself. Then with a slight nod, he turned around and placed his hands behind his back. Ava stepped forward and locked the cuffs around his wrists. And in that moment, it was over. But a strange feeling crept into Ava. Something was off. No resistance, no arguing, no threats of a lawsuit, just silence. As if this man knew this was only the beginning. The cold metal of the handcuffs tightened around his wrists, but he didn't react. No struggling, no arguing, no panicked eyes like Ava had seen in so many others. Only silence. That silence unsettled her. No one accepts being arrested without a fight. But this man was different. "You have the right to remain silent." Ava's voice came out more like routine than a warning. He smirked, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but there was no humor in it, only understanding, as if he had heard those words hundreds of times before. Ava gripped his elbow, guiding him toward the patrol car. "Do you have anything to say?" she asked, almost expecting some kind of defense, a reason to believe she was making the right call. But he simply replied, "You've already made up your mind, haven't you?" That sentence, though spoken softly, struck Ava's mind like a heavy blow. She kept her composure, opened the car door, and pushed him into the back seat. When she shut the door, his reflection in the glass stared back at her, silent, deep as the midnight sea. No fear, no anger, just an eerie patience. Why? She shook off the thought, climbed into the driver's seat, and pulled away. The Davidson County Police Station glowed brightly against the night. Cold, fluorescent lights washed over the polished white tiles, giving the place an almost sterile feel. Ava stepped inside, the man following behind her. Other officers glanced her way, some nodding, as if this were just another routine arrest. But this wasn't routine. She felt it, even if she couldn't explain why. She pushed him down into a chair in the holding area. "Name?" He looked up at her, his gaze unwavering. "I have the right to remain silent, don't I?" This time Ava sensed something different in his voice. Not defiance, not resistance, but anticipation. Anticipating what? Ava opened her mouth, about to say something, but before the words could leave her lips, the office door burst open. A superior stormed in, face pale as a sheet. And in that instant, Ava knew she had made a terrible mistake. The air in the courtroom was stretched thin, ready to snap at any moment. Ava sat on the witness stand, back straight, hands clenched tightly on her lap. She had been here before, but today, something felt different. Across from her, the man she had arrested, John Thomas, sat calmly. No worry, no fear. As if he knew exactly how this was going to play out. "Lieutenant Taylor, can you recount the reason for the defendant's arrest that night?" The prosecutor's voice was deep and firm. Ava cleared her throat. She was ready. "At approximately 10:30 p.m., I was on patrol when I observed the defendant displaying suspicious behavior near an upscale shopping district." "What kind of suspicious behavior?" Ava kept her composure. "He was lingering near closed storefronts, appearing to survey the area." From the defense table, Attorney Isabella Allen rose to her feet. This was where things truly began. "Lieutenant Taylor," Isabella said, walking forward slowly, her eyes locked on Ava. "Did you personally witness Mr. Thomas attempting to break into any store?" Ava tensed her grip slightly. "No." "Did he run when he saw the police?" "No." Isabella nodded, her tone still gentle but razor-sharp. "Then why did you suspect him?" 1 second of silence, then 2. Ava inhaled, steadying herself. "He matched the description of a suspect." "And what was that description?" "Dark suit, tall, walking near the scene of a recent break-in." Isabella let the words settle into the air before she slowly placed her hands on the defense table. "Is walking near a crime scene a criminal offense, Lieutenant?" Ava was cornered. "No," she was forced to admit. Isabella took another step forward. "Lieutenant Taylor, if Mr. Thomas had been a white man, wearing the same suit, of the same height, walking down the same street that night, would you have stopped him?" The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Someone coughed softly, but Ava heard nothing except the pounding of her own heartbeat. She opened her mouth, paused. Isabella tilted her head slightly, her gaze drilling into Ava's. "It's a simple question, Lieutenant." Ava wanted to deny it, wanted to push back, wanted to say that race had nothing to do with this, but the raw truth had been peeled back, layer by layer, until there was nowhere left to hide. And in that moment, she realized She couldn't answer. The silence in the courtroom stretched like a storm on the verge of breaking. On the witness stand, Ava Taylor felt every gaze pinned on her. She had never felt this out of control before. Across from her, Isabella Allen stepped forward, the soft rustling of the case file in her hands the only sound in the room. Lieutenant Taylor, her voice was cold but not harsh. How long have you been in law enforcement? Ava cleared her throat. 12 years. Then I assume you're well versed in the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution? Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the witness stand. She knew this was a trap. Of course. Good. Then tell me. Isabella took another step closer. Under which provision of the Fourth Amendment did you have the right to detain Mr. Thomas? Ava opened her mouth, then stopped, because she didn't have an answer. Isabella nodded, as if she had expected this exact moment. You had no warrant. He had not broken any laws. You didn't even have probable cause. She dropped a stack of documents onto the table with a sharp thud. So tell me, Lieutenant, why did you arrest him? Ava felt the heat creeping up her neck. He refused to provide ID. And is that a crime? Ava clenched her jaw. If an individual is suspected of criminal behavior, what criminal behavior? Isabella cut in, her gaze like a blade. He was walking near a crime scene. Isabella tilted her head slightly. So walking is a crime now? A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Ava's hands balled into fists. She hated this feeling. Isabella slowly placed a photograph on the table. Take a look at this, Lieutenant. Ava glanced down. Surveillance footage. The image showed that John Thomas wasn't the only one walking down that street that night. At least 4 others were visible. 3 were white. Only 1 was stopped. Ava felt her breath slow. Isabella turned to the jury, her voice calm, deliberate. If Mr. Thomas had not been a black man, would Lieutenant Taylor have stopped him? A heavy silence suffocated the room. Ava wanted to argue, wanted to say race had nothing to do with it, but now with everything laid bare, she wasn't sure anymore. The courtroom seemed to freeze in place as John Thomas stood up. He adjusted the sleeves of his suit, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before settling on the judge. Your Honor, I believe it's time I spoke for myself. A dead silence fell over the room. No one had expected this. Ava's hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had witnessed many trials before, but never had she seen a defendant this confident. Mr. Thomas, the judge's voice was steady, authoritative. Do you have something you wish to clarify before the court? John nodded, a faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips. Yes, Your Honor. I think it's time I properly introduce myself. He paused just long enough to let the tension thicken, before continuing. I am Special Agent John Thomas, United States Department of Justice. The room erupted into whispers. A federal agent? Ava felt the world tilt beneath her. Number, this couldn't be. The prosecutor spun toward the defense table, mouth open as if about to object. But the judge raised a hand, signaling for order. John continued, his voice steady, firm. For the past 7 months, I have been conducting an undercover investigation into a serious issue: racial discrimination in law enforcement, specifically unlawful arrests and abuse of power. Ava felt the blood drain from her face. He had been there to investigate officers like her. We have received multiple reports of illegal detentions and racial profiling in this district, John said, his eyes never leaving Ava. And in less than 10 minutes of simply existing in that space, I was arrested without a shred of evidence. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled. Ava couldn't move. Something cold curled in her chest. Not anger, not shame, but a deep, gnawing fear. Not fear of him, but fear of what came next. John held her gaze, his expression devoid of anger or triumph, only deep disappointment. I wasn't there to cause trouble. I wasn't committing a crime. I was just walking home. He paused. But that didn't matter, did it, Lieutenant Taylor? The question, simple yet razor-sharp, sliced through everything Ava had ever believed. She had been so sure she was doing the right thing. But now, standing before the entire courtroom, she saw the truth. She was the problem. The air in the courtroom was thick, heavy, as if every breath carried extra weight. Ava Taylor sat frozen on the witness stand, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. In front of her, the judge looked down at the file now resting on the bench. A thick stack of documents, each page filled with undeniable truths. She tapped her fingers lightly on the desk, her voice firm and unwavering. Based on the evidence presented by the defense in the testimony of federal agent John Thomas, this court concludes that this arrest was not merely an isolated mistake, but part of a much larger, deeply rooted issue within this city's law enforcement system. A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom, quick and uncontrollable, like fire catching dry leaves. Lieutenant Taylor, the judge continued, her sharp gaze locking onto Ava, do you understand that your actions were not just a personal mistake, but a reflection of a systemic failure that has gone unchecked for far too long? Ava swallowed hard. She wanted to argue, wanted to say she was just doing her job, that she wasn't the problem. But when she looked at John Thomas, the man she had cuffed without cause standing there, calm, resolute, without an ounce of smugness, she knew she couldn't lie to herself anymore. The judge placed the file down. We have reviewed your prior arrest records, Lieutenant, and numbers don't lie. Ava felt her stomach clench. Numbers she didn't want to hear this, but the judge went on. In the past 3 years, 78% of your arrests have involved people of color. Of those, more than half resulted in no formal charges. The room fell into a stunned silence. The prosecutor dropped his gaze. A few officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding the eyes of the press. Ava felt the walls closing in around her. Isabella Allen rose to her feet, her voice clear, cold but not vengeful. Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence, we request that all charges against my client be dismissed and that a full federal investigation be launched into Lieutenant Taylor's misconduct, as well as any other officers involved. The final blow had been struck. The judge nodded. Motion granted. The gavel fell, a sharp final crack that ended everything. But for Ava Taylor, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a nightmare she never saw coming. The judge's gavel still echoed in Ava's mind, even as the courtroom emptied around her. She stood there, hands ice cold, her heartbeat pounding so loudly she could hear it in her chest. A full federal investigation will be launched. The Justice Department's words still felt like a blade sinking into her. She swallowed hard, her eyes instinctively searching for John Thomas. He hadn't left yet. He stood there, arms crossed, saying nothing. No smugness, no victorious grin, only deep disappointment. Ava's fist clenched. She wasn't a bad cop. She was just doing her job, right? But when she turned back, the looks from her fellow officers had changed. No one stood beside her. No one placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You okay?" Because she wasn't okay. The next day, Ava sat in her office, staring at an open file, a report of her own arrests over the past 3 years. For the first time, she didn't look at it as a cop. She looked at it as an outsider. The numbers didn't lie. The data on the page hit her like bullets. 78% of her arrests involved people of color. More than half resulted in no formal charges. Complaints of misconduct against her were higher than the department average. Ava took a slow, deep breath. Had she been wrong? She never thought of herself as racist. She never saw herself that way. But this wasn't about what she thought. It was about what she had done. A knock at the door made her flinch. The door swung open. 2 federal agents stood there. One of them held up a badge. Lieutenant Taylor, we need you to come with us. Ava's jaw tightened. She wanted to say she was innocent, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she could. Ava stepped out of the interrogation room, her legs numb, as if they no longer belonged to her. She had no idea how long she had been in there. An hour? 2? The entire morning? The federal agent's question still echoed in her mind. Are you aware that over 70% of your arrests involve people of color? Do you realize you've repeatedly justified stops without reasonable suspicion? Have you ever questioned your own decisions, Lieutenant Taylor? Each question hit her like a punch to the gut, and she had no answers. The police department's break room was eerily silent. Ava pushed the door open, expecting the usual sense of familiarity. Instead, the air was suffocating. She felt the weight of her colleagues' stares. No smiles, no nods, only distance. She had once believed that the badge was a symbol of power, but today it was a stain. She caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror, but the woman staring back wasn't the confident Lieutenant Ava Taylor anymore. She was someone falling apart. She sat at her desk, but her hands refused to move. Her phone buzzed. A message from her lawyer. Ava, bad news. The DOJ is reviewing your entire career. Not just John Thomas, all of it. Everything. A chill ran down her spine. She had lost control. She had always thought she was the one setting the rules. But now she was just another piece on someone else's board. Ava leaned forward, elbows on the desk, head bowed. For the first time in her life, she had no idea what to do next. Ava Taylor sat on the long bench outside the police department, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of cold coffee. The Nashville sky was gray, but not as heavy as the weight pressing against her chest. She had sat here before, after long shifts, after arrests she had once believed were the right thing to do. But now everything had changed. Everything she had believed about justice, the law, and herself was unraveling in a way she had never imagined. A glass door slammed shut in the distance. John Thomas emerged from the Department of Justice office building. He was still dressed in a dark suit, but today his eyes no longer held the look of a man on trial. They were the eyes of a man who had won. Ava took a deep breath as he walked closer. She didn't know if he would stop, but he did. So the investigation continues? His voice held no mockery, no malice, just a simple question. Ava looked down and nodded. Yes. A moment of silence stretched between them. Then, in a measured tone, he asked, Have you ever wondered how this would have ended if I weren't a federal agent? Ava lifted her head, but she had no answer, because she already knew. If John Thomas had been just another ordinary black man, without a title, without a federal badge in his pocket, what would have happened to him? A false criminal record? A wrongful conviction? Or worse, a fate with no justice at all? Ava had never asked herself that question before, and that was the problem. John Thomas studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. No accusations, no disgusted glances, just disappointment. He turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate, fading into the busy streets. Ava watched until he disappeared from view. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. Inside her office, a stack of case files waited for her signature. Names, faces, numbers, people she had arrested. How many of them should never have been there? A question she had never thought to ask before. But now, it was the only question that mattered. She picked up the pen. But for the first time in her career, she couldn't sign. The lesson in this story is not just about justice, but about awareness and responsibility. Ava Taylor had believed she was doing the right thing, that her duty was to protect her community from threats. But she had never truly questioned whether her decisions were shaped by unconscious bias. She was not a villain, but she was not a hero either. She was simply part of a system she had never examined critically. This story is a reminder that power does not equal righteousness, and law enforcement is not just about laws. It's about ethics and fairness. Someone may believe they hold no bias, but if they never question themselves, never listen, and never stop to consider the impact of their actions, then they are still part of the problem. Justice is not something that simply exists. It must be built, protected, and, most importantly, held accountable by those who enforce it. And sometimes change doesn't come from clutching onto power, but from having the courage to admit when you're wrong.